This is the Storypunks podcast, a show where we talk about all the punks. So steampunk, dieselpunk, cyberpunk, and all the other punks. I'm your host, Cindy Grigg. This is episode 2. I will be interviewing Dan Wells, a cyberpunk and biopunk author. I'm very excited for that. Beginning of every episode, I quickly update you on what I'm working on. Right now, I'm finishing my series, Peacock Levine and the Etherean Fates of Naught. And Naught is the grandmother of Thor. So it's Jane Austen times or Napoleonic War times meets, well, there's nothing really like it, actually, because a lot of the Norse mythology has focused on the men and mine focuses on the women. So I include awesomeness like the Valkyries, and this is urban fantasy, steampunk, manor punk, and alternate history. Even though it's Regency era, I include steampunk because that technology actually began at the very end of the previous century. It's weird, it's wonderful. If any of this sounds good to you, I would love if you go to my site, cindygrigg.com, and sign up to be a beta reader. Without further ado, let's jump into this week's interview because you are just going to love hearing from cyberpunk author Dan Wells. I met Dan at a convention. He's also a member of a podcast I love called Writing Excuses. I loved what he had to say about cyberpunk, so I reached out to him and I was just thrilled by what we went over in the interview. And if you're new to cyberpunk, this is a great way to get started. Also, if you're a seasoned cyberpunker, I think you'll really enjoy hearing about Dan's approach. Dan is a New York Times bestselling author, and he's best known for his horror series, I Am Not a Serial Killer, which I love that title, of which the first book is now an award-winning movie through IFC Midnight. His other novels include The Hollow City, a supernatural thriller about schizophrenia, Extreme Makeover, in which a beauty company destroys the world, and 2 young adult science fiction series, The Post-Apocalypse Partials and The Cyberpunk Mirador. He has written for television on the upcoming science fiction series Extinct, and wrote and produced the horror comedy stage play A Night of Blacker Darkness. He co-hosts the Hugo-winning podcast for aspiring writers called Writing Excuses, as I already mentioned, which has expanded to include its own writing conference. So check that out if you are a creator or a writer. He also writes short fiction and game fiction and edited the anthology Altered Perceptions to help raise funds for and awareness of mental illness. Dan lives in northern Utah with his wife, 6 children, and more than 400 board games. So welcome to the show once again, Dan. It's so great to have you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I am happy to be here.
Absolutely. Hey, so let's jump into the Q&A. We have lots of questions. I have several questions, and then we also have questions from social media and the show phone line for Dan. So first question, Dan. In this show, we discuss the punks, and today we're focusing on cyberpunk. Since everyone defines this term a little bit differently, what's your take on it, and what do you feel qualifies as cyberpunk?
Oh, man. Yes, everyone does define this very differently. And I actually remember, even 15 years ago, getting into arguments about whether cyberpunk is even possible now, or if we have to call it post-cyberpunk or something ridiculous like that. My personal definition would be that cyberpunk is basically near future, although we're almost at the point where you can tell cyberpunk stories set in the present. But cyberpunk is primarily concerned with, like I said, in my definition, with the kind of the borderlines between technology and humanity. And what does it mean to actually be human? Where does reality and virtual reality, where's the line between those? How does humanity change as you start adding in bionic or cybernetic enhancements, as you start dealing with all of these extra technologies that really change how a human being interacts with the world.
Very cool. So as with a lot of the punks that we talk about on this show, that intersection between technology and humanity, I do see a lot of the body modification and stuff like that. So beautiful, beautiful definition. Thank you.
Thank Thank you.
So next, tell us about each of your cyberpunk books. Now, I believe the Mirador series is the main cyberpunk, but I just want to make sure there's not other elements in other books and just make sure we have a clear understanding of your works.
You could make the argument, I think, that parts of the partial series include cyberpunk elements to them, but I wouldn't call them cyberpunk. I think it's basically just the Mirador series is all that I've written in the genre. And so that's 3 books, the blue screen, ones and zeros. And then the third book is called Active Memory, and that comes out in February 2018.
So exciting. So this is a series you want to jump into. I listened to this as I was on a hike, and I was just blown away by the narrator combined with obviously Dan's awesome story. And I thought your narrator did a really good job on blue screen.
Well, thank you very much. I agree. She's fantastic. She is, that represents the first time that I've gotten to help pick my own narrator. And so we kind of handpicked her out of a pretty large group. And she's just phenomenal. Yeah,
I couldn't believe how well she handled all the different accents. And because there's a lot of diversity, we'll get to a question about that, but I loved it. So as the last part of this question, what themes are brought about by this Mirador series?
What themes? Man.
We're getting deep.
We're going deep into the AP English here. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's a lot. One of my favorite aspects of cyberpunk, kind of a sub-theme that shows up in a lot of it, is the privatization of government. For example, in Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson, I enjoyed the book. I thought it was cool. And then we got to the part where he was arrested and was kept in a franchised jail cell in the basement of a convenience store because actual jails and prisons had all been privatized. And I just thought that's where the book jumped from good to great for me. And so all 3 of the books have that kind of running in the background, the idea that corporations run the world now and that governments are pretty much there in name only, and all of the real power is held by these giant megacorps and zaibatsus is what William Gibson used to call them, zaibatsus. So anyway, so that's going on. There's also the idea that of constant connectivity. In the world of Mirador, everyone has a computer, or most people have a computer installed in their brain called a genie, which is kind of my concept of what's next after the cell phone, the smartphone that everybody carries and everyone's always connected. Well, in Mirador, it's actually installed in your brain. And so people are online 24/7. You can have phone and text conversations with people, halfway around the world. And so that idea that distance is kind of meaningless now in a lot of ways. The main character, Marisa, she has 4 best friends, and 2 of them live in LA, very nearby, and then one's in Shanghai, and one's in Mumbai. So they're just all over. Everyone is in a different place.
Which is so cool. And I really thought about the younger audience that might be, younger than me, that might be connecting with this because it is so global. And I think that's more of a reality than when I grew up and when I was a teenager.
Kind of where that came from is I was working on outlining this book, and my office at the time was down next door to my teenage daughter's bedroom. And I heard a conversation between her and 2 of her friends. And I thought, she does not have permission to have 2 friends in the bedroom right now. What's going on? I thought there was only one. And I went and peeked in, and it was her and her friend, and then actually one of her friends from Germany on like a FaceTime or a Skype or something. And that's when it really clicked for me. Distance had changed, that the online world is melded so completely with the real world that it often doesn't matter where you are, because you can still communicate instantly with everyone.
Yeah, that's a really cool story. I can totally picture this happening. And it's cool for me as someone that didn't have that relationship with technology when I was growing up, because it's just fun to revisit, oh man, what would have my my teenage years or whatever, my college years been like with that. And it's just cool. But then also you're in this amazing world. So, okay, next question. So as I've begun listening, so I've listened to Blue Screen and I've begun with the series, I'm blown away by that diverse set of characters. And I just wonder what kind of research or tools or tricks of the trade you could share with writers. We have a lot of writers that will listen and probably will want to know how you've pulled that off. That's a hard thing to do.
Well, thank you. A lot of that started with, well, I'll say two different directions, and both of them came from my own personal experience of living outside of the U.S. I am Mormon. I served a Mormon mission in Mexico when I was 19. And so I lived there for 2 years, got to know the culture really well. And I lived in Chihuahua, which is right on the border. We used to joke that it's the other half of Texas. Ciudad Juarez is basically El Paso on, south of the river. And during the day, looking out across the city, you can't tell where the border is. And so that, that mingling of, in the States, we call it Spanglish, where you speak both languages at once. In Juarez, they called it Pocho, which is basically their word for the same idea. And that border culture of, Mexican Americans or Chicano culture, I got to know that and love that, and have been I've spent a long time trying to figure out how I could put that into a book. And so when I started looking at a cyberpunk series, I thought, well, this is perfect. Cyberpunk has, I think, a very long history of kind of multicultural characters, especially the way William Gibson wrote it, where it was so steeped in this Japanese culture. And I thought, well, I'm going to do the same thing, but you know what? I'm going to do it with Mexico instead of Japan. So let's go for it. And kind of created this world where that permeability of the border had kind of reversed a little bit. And so Mexico is where all the jobs are, and the United States is kind of in its twilight years as a world superpower. And they live in LA. It's a big Mexican American family. And then building from that was just trying to, who are her best friends? Who does she hang out with? What else? They are a video game team. And put together a group of friends, and realized after I'd already built the whole thing and written several chapters that I didn't have any white Americans. There's a German girl, because I was living in Germany at the time. But yeah, it kind of felt very natural. And like I said, I didn't notice how diverse it was until after I'd already gotten embedded into it, just because that felt right as I was putting together the cast.
It's a good bid for us writers to get out and have a life, because that's how you were able to write it. So this comes from Twitter. We had a question from Sean Talon, and it's Talion. I hope I'm saying your name right, Sean. But Sean asks, what evolutions has Dan gone through in regards to storytelling? So looking for personal Eureka moments, which is awesome. And that's in regards to overall storycraft or a specific story.
Well, the way that I tell stories has changed a lot, I think. And one of the big Eureka moments for me was 2 years ago when I started working on a stage adaptation of one of my books. I, years ago, self-published a vampire comedy novel called A Night of Blacker Darkness. And one of the reasons that we were never able to sell that to a real publisher, that I ended up self-publishing it instead, is because it is, in my opinion, designed for stage. It always felt wrong as a book to me. And people love it, I love it, and if you love it, that's fine. But I always had this feeling in the back of my head that it really needed to be a script rather than a book. And so a couple of years ago, I sat down with my sister, who works in theater, and the two of us co-wrote a stage adaptation of that novel. And looking at the way what we had to cut out for time and for readability, I guess, really changed the way that I see plot and see the importance of scenes. There were things that in the book worked fine, but then once we had to, get this down to like a 90-minute show instead of this giant sprawling novel, we had to look at each scene and say, well, why is this scene here? What is this scene adding to the story? Does this need to be in the story? Or is it just there because it's funny? Or is it just there because it's trying to do something else? Is it just killing time? And that, like I said, that changed the way that I see plot. If this scene's going to be in the book, it has to be serving a purpose. It has to be advancing the plot. There has to be a driving reason for it to be there. And I do think that there's absolutely room in a novel for scenes that are just there because they're funny or because they're cute or because you have a fun little story that you want to tell on the way to getting to your big stuff. But if you can do that while also directly driving forward the plot and telling the story you're trying to tell, then I think it just fits together so much better.
It has a stronger punch and it's just more efficient. That's awesome.
Exactly.
Yeah, an audiobook of your novel is going to be 8 hours, but we're talking putting on a play or putting together a movie or whatever, and it's much shorter. So
yeah, well, just because I know people are going to ask or people are going to assume that I mean what I don't mean, it's not so much about time as it is about efficiency, like you said. I don't think that every novel needs to be a 90-minute script. Obviously, we want things from a novel that we can't get from any other medium, and that's why we love reading books, because they can give us a larger, richer experience. But if you have that punchiness, if you have that tight efficiency where everything is always serving at least one, if not multiple purposes at the same time, then it all just comes to life.
The next Twitter question, this comes from Ben Lane Hodson, and he asks, how do you do your tech research for your cyberpunk books?
Well, one of the reasons that I decided to write Cyberpunk is because I kind of am always doing that research anyway. We live in such an innovative period of history where we are constantly inventing new things and finding new uses for inventions we already have. And so a lot of the technologies in the book come from things that people are already doing or trying to do in the real world. I would read things about, there was a university 4 or 5 years ago that put autonomous mobile garbage cans into their cafeteria so that when you were done with your food, this little garbage can would roll up to your table so you could throw your stuff away. And it would just kind of patrol the cafeteria, which I thought was really neat. And I do think that that is going to be part of the future of drone technology, is that all these little devices are going to be around. And so you see in the Mirador books, I have what I call nullies, which are basically just little drone robots that do chores for us, that they'll go outside and they'll water your lawn, or they'll be inside like a Roomba and clean up your house. So there's that. There's the stuff that I already was kind of aware of. But then when it came time to figure out what the future was going to be like, advancing this 35 years into the future, I had to sit down. I had to do a lot of more direct research, like he asks, on all the different branches. And at the risk of sounding arrogant, I think it's relatively easy to pick one branch of technology and extend that into the future and say, well, okay, I think I know where drones are going to be in the year 2050. I mean, I won't be exactly right, but I can make an educated guess. What became very difficult for me was trying to figure out where society as a whole would be once we took into account drones and cybernetic enhancements and internet connectivity and advances in biomedicine and in genetic engineering. And what are we going to be eating in 35 years? And what is our space program going to look like in 35 years? And every branch of technology all at once changes society so much that I don't know how possible it is. I eventually had to kind of step back and say, okay, I can't predict the future. I need to stop pretending like I can predict the future and just create a world in which I can tell the kind of stories I want to tell. Like autonomous cars. In the Mirador series, cars drive themselves so exclusively that the teenage protagonists of the story don't even know how to drive a car and have no concept that anyone would ever drive a car by themselves. I think that is wildly accelerated. I don't think we will get to the point where every car on the road is autonomous in 35 years. I don't think that's going to happen. But it's the story I wanted to tell, so I pretended like it's going to happen and put that into the world. Let's see, I'm trying to think of a better example I can give of specific tech research.
While you're thinking, I loved that you were very specific about how they interact or how they control the tech. So they have their genie hooked to their brain, their interface, right? And they blink. That's so cool. And I feel like then I could really be there as they took their action to control the tech. It was cool that I could picture myself doing it. So,
anyway, well, awesome. Thank you. I've done this twice, actually. I did this in partials, and then I did it again in Mirador, where I had these grand plans that I was going to have a full voice-activated computer system, because I do think that that's where we're headed. I mean, but what I have found both times that I have tried to put that into a book is that I end up characterizing the AI more than I want to.
Oh, interesting. And you've chosen to not want to do that. That's really interesting.
One thing that I very directly steered away from in Mirador is that I did not want full like AI. I don't want sentient AI. I don't want AI that pretends to be sentient. The best that we get is there's the swarm intelligence that runs the road system, where the cars kind of all talk to each other. And then there is the home computer, which kind of the idea of a smart home taken to a great degree. They have a name. Marissa's home computer is named Olaya, and she just kind of runs their house and tells people where things are. And so, especially in the third book, you get a little more of a conversation with Olaya, but I dialed that way back from where I intended to go, because Olaya kept turning into a character, and I didn't want her to be a character. I just wanted her to be an assistant device, and I suspect that might be where we're headed as a society, where the more we have things like Siri and Alexa and Google Home, the more we're going to start personifying them, the more we're going to start ascribing personalities to them. And you can see this done really well in movies like Her, but it's not what I wanted to do with this story, and so I dialed it way back. And so I'm glad you like the blinking interface on the genies. I think that's really cool as well. It is not the first direction I intended to go with that interface.
Oh, interesting.
The one that ended up working best for this particular story.
Did you start out with a voice on that?
Yeah, she was going to be able to talk to her genie. And there is a part in, I think in the first book, I can't remember now which book it's in, where she decides that she is out of time. She doesn't have time to be constantly blinking and paying attention visually to her genie. Oh, it is in the first book. It's when she needs to run outside and save her sisters during a gang shooting. She doesn't want to be focusing her eyes on her interface, and so she switches it to a voice. And so then there's one scene where she's able to shout commands at her genie, and it will work. That was kind of going to be, in the original draft, how the genies worked all the time. But I decided that was just getting in the way of the story. So it's gone.
That's so cool to hear about after reading the book. That's really cool. Thank you. I love those kind of details. Okay, so now we have a phone message. This is something that listeners of the show can do, and if you're not familiar with this part of the show, basically this is a phone line you can call at 801-637-5016, and you can leave a message. And for my callers, as well as those who have submitted Twitter questions, I would love to send a gift of some of the books we're talking about from Dan Wells, and I will be in contact with you about those. So thank you for submitting these questions. And here we go. This call was from Robert from Denver, and he actually has 3 questions for you in here. But they're all related. So here we go.
Hi, this is Robert from Denver. My question is, how do you keep an ongoing series fresh with new ideas? Also, writing can be very difficult, and I'm looking for inspiration, mainly as in payoff. And what's the most rewarding thing about finishing so many stories?
About finishing a book?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. First question first. How do you keep a series fresh with new ideas, book over book? I don't have a great answer to this, because ideas are always the easiest part, I think, at least for me. I never have to worry about, where do my ideas come from and that kind of question, because there's always stuff. So with Mirador, as a good example, there are, as we just discussed, so many different ideas, different kinds of technologies, and trying to predict where they were all going to be in the future, just by itself sparked a ton of ideas about what this world might look like. And so in the first book, it's a digital drug. I wanted a world where everyone had a computer in their heads, kind of taking off from the smartphone and installing it directly into your brain. And then that suggests the idea, well, which operating system would you trust in your head?
Totally.
And how badly could that go wrong? Which led directly to Blue Screen, the digital drug, and the idea that there could be malware getting into your actual physical brain and changing your behavior. And so we start with that. But then there's different directions to take that. If we're just looking at the genie itself, well, the fact that there's a computer in your head that can overlay visual signals onto your eyes so that you can see things, and they do GPS arrows that can guide them around. They have little chat windows that pop up. If you can do that, then you can also do virtual reality, which is where the video game come from that they play. And so I wanted to put an actual video game tournament into the second book. And that's how that one starts, is with they're actually playing this big virtual reality game. And then what are all the ways that I can play with virtual reality? And what are all the ways that I can find new connections? The idea that I read an article while I was writing the book about there were some people who just thought it was interesting to try to contact the Internet of Things, because we are so accustomed to only interfacing with websites and browsers. I mean, that's basically all we do. When we use the internet, we're contacting websites and we're contacting other people's phones. But that represents something like 10% of the internet connected devices in the world. And so
I didn't know that. Wow.
It is. It's amazing. Most cars built in the last 10 years are internet enabled to some degree. A lot of home appliances, security cameras, all of these things. And so these guys, just kind of as a project, they were interested. They started sending out signals that would basically just ask a device, who are you and what do you do? And they got back all of these incredible things of, these weird, like internet refrigerators that you see that I don't know anyone who actually owns one, but you see them in hardware stores and stuff all the time. And they get all these interesting things back. And so I was like, well, how can I play with that idea? And that's why in book 2, they hack into somebody's t-shirt. There is an internet-enabled shirt that has like a camera in it, so then it can change what it's displaying in real time. And the ability of a piece of fabric to display a computer image, something we already have in our world.
Yeah.
And so I just added to that, well, it's an internet enabled shirt, which means they can hack it and they can see through that camera and they can change what it displays. And that was a really fun scene to write just because of how weird it was. I've never seen somebody hack into somebody's clothing before. Getting into the third book, I play with that idea even more of, what can the genie do? What can the genie perceive? And I don't want to give away any spoilers. The third book, though, is also where we finally get into the idea of biotech. We've all seen pictures of like the lab rat with a human ear growing out of its back because they've figured out how to use them to grow new human tissue and things like that. And so the third book, one of the main driving plot lines there is biotechnology and of a biotech company that is trying to protect its proprietary IP, even though that IP is people in some cases. There was a big news story. This is probably 10 years ago now, where a gene sequencing company tried to, and successfully did, copyright specific DNA sequences, not because they had invented them, but because they were the first people to find them and codify them. And so you, as an actual person with no contact in your entire life with this company, contain their copyrighted genetic sequence in your body. And that can be taken to a ridiculous extreme if you are a science fiction author trying to write about a technological dystopia. So we've got that showing up in the third book and all kinds of fun, cool things like that. So how to keep it fresh, just always be reading. I guess all of my anecdotes that I just shared with you come from some cool thing that I read. So stay on top of news, and particularly if you're writing science fiction, stay on top of weird news, because there's so much weird news out there that I think that it's just a bottomless fountain of ideas. What were the other two questions? I talked so much about that first one.
Well, they're related, so this is great. Also, writing can be difficult, so just looking for that inspiration. I think he wants you to speak to what the payoff feels like so he can envision it, because writing's hard.
Writing is hard. So what I like to tell people is, first of all, that becoming an author, writing a book, doing this successfully is so much harder than you think it's going to be. Even if you're in the middle of it, doing it right now, and you're like, wow, this sucks. Well, guess what? It probably is going to get harder. But I don't like the kind of prevalent internet attitude that writers are always sad or always stressed out, or that writing is a chore, or that we're always depressed because writing is such a slog. If that's your feeling about it, you shouldn't be doing it. You should find something you actually enjoy. Writing is, first of all, I don't think you should have to wait until a project is finished before you can be happy about it. I encourage you to try to find joy in the process itself. As wall postery as that sounds, it really is. If you don't love the act of writing, don't become a writer. But it's harder than you think it's going to be, but then the payoff is so much better than you think it's going to be. When you actually have a finished book that you can hand to somebody or send them in an email and say, here, I wrote this, you can read a thing. If you get it published, either traditionally or you self-publish, however it is, when you actually see a book that has your name on the cover, that's amazing. That's an amazing feeling. This is, I think that writers get into writing because we are all readers and because we love to read. And so being able to suddenly be a part of that conversation with books of our own is, it's the dream that we all have. And yes, it feels incredible when you do it. But just to reiterate, if it doesn't feel incredible getting there, you either need to change the way you do it or something. Find a way to love the process and not just the result. I
think that's awesome advice. And that comes from someone who's seen it all and has been through so much with his writing career. And it leads me to my next question about what you can find on Dan's website. So this was such a fun dive for me to go to just the About tab of Dan's website. And you can see so much autobiographical information. So, I mean, biograph, I don't know if you wrote it, Dan, but I'm assuming
I did write it, and I wrote it years ago. That's like 10 years old. So I need to go back and update it.
Okay. Well, anyone who reads it is just, their head will spin a little bit in admiration and be like, how do you get all this done, Dan? And it really is impressive. And then if we add another 10 years onto that. So my question is, what is your secret for writing productivity and staying with it? You've touched on it a little bit already with the last question, but what's your secret?
Well, I'll tell you, and this is gonna start depressing. Okay, you ready for this?
Okay.
As much stuff as I have done, and as impressive as that bio on the website looks, this business is never easy to maintain. There never comes a point where you can just sit back and coast. Despite 13 books in print, despite New York Times bestseller, despite all of that stuff, I have not been able to sell a new book this entire year. And I've been rejected. I think the count is up to 9 now, 9 rejections on various books from various publishers just this year alone. And so, but I don't say that because I want to discourage people. I say that because I want you to know, first of all, that it's still hard for us, just like it's still hard for you as an aspiring writer. So don't think that I am coming from that I'm trying to talk down to people or patronize them and say, pat your head and tell you to just keep trying. We're always, all of us, still trying. That's what this is. But then the other thing that I need to say about this is that several years ago, I want to say like 6 or 7 years ago, I went out to dinner with Brandon Sanderson, Brandon Mull, and James Dashner. And this was kind of right at the peak of, wow, Maze Runner is the hot new thing. Brandon had, already gotten the Wheel of Time stuff. Brandon Mull has always been huge. And so I was sitting there with these 3 guys, and we were at some burger place. And I just, as the conversation went on, I got more and more depressed to the point that I went home and literally thought, why am I even doing this? I should give up. Like, my success is not even in the same state, let alone the same league as those people. They're so much more successful. They are selling so much better. I should just give up. And then I stopped and I thought, well, if I were to give up, what would I even do? Because this is my whole life. Is all I do is write books. I do it for my job, and then I also do it as a hobby because I love to do it. What would I do instead? And after a night of soul searching, I would probably still be writing books because that's what I love to do. Even if I quit being an author professionally, I would still be writing books in my spare time because storytelling is what I love to do. And that's when I realized that it didn't matter how successful I was. I mean, at a certain level, yes, because I have to feed my family, but I don't have to be, a James Dashner level author to enjoy what I do. I don't have to be a James Dashner level author to consider myself successful. I am able to feed my family, and that's all I really need, right? I can feed my kids, I can pay my mortgage, and I get to have fun while I do it, doing something that I love. And so that, for me, that's why I do this, and that's how I do this, is I always remember, well, what would I do if I stopped? Same thing I'm doing now.
Exactly. That's so awesome. And this is coming from, I know Dan's being very modest and done so much. So go visit his About page and it will put in perspective what he is saying. And if someone like Dan feels this way, I just love how honest you've been, Dan, because if you feel that way, it's okay that we feel this way. And I know that you are always so relatable and I just really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Absolutely. Okay, so last question. Are you ready, Dan?
I am ready.
Why is cyberpunk important right now? So do we need more cyberpunk in the world? And if so, why?
I do think we need more cyberpunk in the world, and I do think we need it right now. There is a wave. It is growing slowly, but there is a kind of a new wave of cyberpunk. It's coming back. We just got a new Blade Runner movie. There are elements of cyberpunk cropping up all over the place. There was a TV show that was announced last year, 2 years ago. It's a Matt Damon, Ben Affleck produced thing about, I think it's about privatized government.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember. It's not out yet, but they've announced it, and we're seeing all these things crop up, and it's because we have hit this point where we've kind of caught up to a lot of, if not most of, the technology that they guessed at in the 80s when that first wave of cyberpunk came through, and we had books like Neuromancer and things. I mean, we're not living in Neuromancer, but we do have the net that they envisioned. We do have the Matrix. We do have all of these incredible amounts of connectivity. We have, cybernetic enhancements popping up. We have people who are able to do this. I've met cyborgs, people who have implants that allow them to do cool things with their bodies, and elective cyborgs, which is, it's easy to point at something like those cool runner blades that they use, in the Special Olympics, people who are amputees or for whatever reason don't have legs, that they've got these cool runner blades. And that's a cool cybernetic thing, but taking that next step into elective cybernetics. My body is relatively healthy, but I'm going to cut it open and change it on purpose because I'm going to add this technology to it. That's a real thing in the world today. We are surrounded by all of these ideas that they played with 30, 40 years ago in cyberpunk and are now real. And so we are writing more stories to help us deal with the world that we're trying to create and understand at the same time. We've hit this point of future shock where we're like, the world is so different. I remember reading something just a couple of weeks ago about how my generation specifically, born between 77 and 83, that is what they consider to be that little 6-year period, are the kids who grew up in an analog world but then went to college for a digital world. And so they were kind of still in a formative period when society switched. And and we're all seeing this. We're watching it happen in front of our eyes. And so fiction and stories that allow us to explore that future shock and explore our own relationship with technology and with drones and with constant internet connectivity and all of these things that we're inventing faster than we can process. I think that we need as much cyberpunk as we can get.
We need the therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Just kidding. But I love what you said, because it's a great concept for this show, because this show brings together so many different punks, and it just goes to show that as a creator, you don't need to shy away from combining them. Dan has combined some biopunk and some cyberpunk, and it's what makes it relevant, because all those threads are going on. And it's why I was interested in creating this show, because I feel like there is a lot of intersectionality among those. And I'm so excited. This has been just a wonderful way to start out our discussion about cyberpunk on this show, Dan. I just couldn't have asked for a more perfect way to launch it. And I just really appreciate your time.
Hey, thank you very much.
Yes,
and,
thank you so much.
Just as a final plug,
Good.
If you like biopunk, like I said, that third Mirador book is right up your alley. So
absolutely. And we'll just end with Dan telling us where we can find out more about all his work.
Okay, so my website that she mentioned earlier is thedanwells.com. And there, that has my bio, that has brief descriptions of all the books. It also has, and this is important, a way to sign up for my newsletter. I have a mailing list that goes out once a month, and that will tell you everything that I'm working on. Between the mailing list and the Patreon, which is also linked on my website, you can find out and even read clips of what I'm working on right now, books that I've written before, kind of see my thoughts. I'm doing a series right now where I go through that book to stage adaptation process, scene by scene, and talk about why we did what we did. And so
that is cool. That is really cool. Yeah.
And then just remember the Dan Wells. That's where I am on Twitter. That's where I am on Facebook, Instagram, and Tumblr, the Dan Wells.
Awesome. And let's not forget that Dan is associated with Writing Excuses, where you can learn so much about the craft of writing. They also touch on tons of business topics. I love that podcast. So thank you so much for that. And they also have instruction based off of that show. So for all of you listeners who are creators, you're writers, this is a wonderful way to get started just by visiting thedanwells.com. Thank you so much, Dan.
Oh, thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed that interview as much as I did. If you would like to beta read my works in progress, please go to cindygrigg.com. So CINDYGRIGG, that's 2 G's.com. Again, it's wonderful to have you here, and please visit storypunks.world to learn more and to get involved.